Ladies and gentlemen, this third lecture in the series on the art of Jheronimus Bosch and Pieter Bruegel the Elder will focus on a particular characteristic of their work that is rarely discussed, which is the visual complexity of their imagery. I will discuss a group of paintings by Bosch, Bruegel and Bruegel from the perspective that various forms of visual complexity that they show were designed to trap and entangle the beholder in a process of viewing that served a whole range of aesthetic, epistemological and religious purposes. My general point of departure are remarks made by the anthropologist Alfred Gell some 20 years ago in his book Art and Agency, regarding strikingly intricate, labyrinth-like patterns that can be observed in decorative art forms in a variety of cultures. Cretan labyrinth designs and Celtic knotwork, of which you see here an example, offer clear examples of such complex patterns. Central in Gell's analysis of such patterns is the notion of entanglement. Gell's explanation of how complex patterns entangle the viewer into their design helps us understand the effect that different forms of visual complexity have on the beholder, also of Bosch's and Bruegel's inventions. One of the characteristics of complex patterns that were noted by Gell was their tendency to involve the viewer in a process of viewing that never can be said to come to a satisfactory end. Gell explained how patterns such as the one found in gravestones in Aberdeen, or patterns such as here, marking thresholds in houses in southern India, appeal to our tendency to visually break up with our eyes the pattern in individual segments, to follow the lines, so to speak, to identify the basic repetitive units constituting the pattern, and to follow with our eyes the flow of interwoven lines, real and suggested lines, and to make up the pattern as a whole, to understand the pattern as a whole. He argued that at some point, which you can test yourself, one will lose track of these individually constituting units or lines, and you will get confused, entangled in the visual complexity of the pattern. You will be trapped in your own impulse to understand the makeup of the pattern. Such patterns, Gell argued, not only draw the viewer into the visual image, but, he says, these patterns bring about attachment between people and artifacts and bind persons to things, also to things seen. The pattern draws you into the image, where you will be lost at some point. Gell's analysis of visually complex patterns is useful, I think, helpful for understanding of the visual complexity that characterizes the art of Jheronimus Bosch and Pieter Bruegel. In the Garden of Earthly Delights, which I'm sure you will recognize to be very complex, we find complicated formal arrangements all over, even forms of physical entanglement and entrapment that result in visual involvement and entrapment of you, the viewer, as well. One example is a scene in the center panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights, which shows three men who are ensnared in the prickly leaves of a huge bulbous plant from which a single thistle flower grows that has attracted an over-proportioned butterfly. This kind of human entanglement, and animal entanglement if you will, in an oversized plant is typical for late medieval border illumination and tapestries. But in these examples that you see here, the ensnarement of figures in floral growths never reaches the level of intricacy we see in Bosch. Here in Bosch, the men are ensnared in a capricious knot of body parts and act a kind of theatrical performance, we would call it, with erotic, playful, but also aggressive overtones. Their legs, arms, and hands are intertwined in such an artificial and complicated way that the viewer is led to visually disentangle the figure knot and imaginatively reassemble the individual hands, feet, and legs in an effort to make sense of their enigmatic postures. The acrobatic extravagance of this body composite, the connection with the nectar-sucking butterfly, and the vicinity, as you see in the background, and the vicinity to the men behind this group who are gathered for a baby bird feeding, suggests that all these men have fallen into a kind of stupor or delirium due to their exposure to the intoxicating fruit and nectar. The abundance of erotic activities and the simultaneous consumption of fruit throughout the garden in the entire painting suggests that all men and women are subject to this intoxicating effect of the fruit of love. I'm less concerned here with these particular aspects of this state of mind and the actions. I plan to do this in the last lecture in the series. What I would like to do here and emphasize here is the bodily entanglement of many figures with other humans, but also with plants and animals, which puts the viewer in the position of wanting to unfold, to reverse engineer these hybrid concoctions in their constituting parts, even before we start to think about their possible symbolic connotations. This purely perceptual process will then run often wild in the very formal complexity of the imagery and cause the viewer to get visually and mentally ensnared in the very complexity he or she, will try to unravel. Another example of this image-viewer relationship can be observed in the immediate foreground of the central panel. Here in the center, you see a large group of naked men and women who are tightly packed together around a huge hollow fantasy berry. A man sits in the opening of the fruit and has opened his mouth to a red berry that a male duck is offering him. The man holds a twig with two larger red berries in his right hand, while an arm sticking out of the vessel suggests that inside the vessel is another person lying or kneeling in a position evoking a particular erotic encounter with the head of this person with the crotch of the man. And this here I will stop, of course, my description and leave it to your imagination, which will show you how entangled you are in the image. The figures surrounding this hardly veiled erotic scene are portrayed with a tangle of intersecting hands, feet, and legs, a motif that at the time was understood as an evocation of another form, a very particular form of bodily entanglement. The complex and curious intertwinement of body parts, which invites the viewer to figure out, literally, which hand or leg belongs to whom, and who is touching whom, and snare us visually in the very erogenous zones that the melee of hands simultaneously veil and unveil. From here, one could roam the entire painting, and one could find many more examples of this all-encompassing entanglement among humans, plants, animals, and even the landscape. If there is anything like an anchor of clarity and quietude in this overwhelming visual complexity, it is the Imago Dei, the image of Christ, the Creator, in the left panel. And as we have seen in another discussion of Bosch's triptych with the Temptation of St. Anthony last week, that this pictorial strategy of offering in the religious protagonist a visual anchor, here in the background, in the margin or in the background of the composition, that is otherwise filled with all kinds of phantasmagorical and enigmatic images, that kind of contrast, here quietude, and the rest is this tanglement of images. That contrast is very fundamental to Bosch's pictorial thinking at large. In Bosch's triptych in Lisbon, but also here in the Garden of Earthly Delights, the religious protagonist thematizes its role as anchor or haven of clarity in the sea of bewildering details by seeking direct eye contact with you, the viewer. Of course, I am referring to the face of Christ. This axis of mutually returned gazes between Christ and you and Christ, is the lifeline, so to speak, from which the viewer again and again can roam the picture without letting his or her eye entirely getting lost and ensnared in the tumbling of forms. The penchant for the fascinating intricacies of evil phantasms is equally and irresistibly built into the picture, however. It is clearly not the intention of the picture to teach the beholder not to delve in the melee of figures and only to look at the religious protagonist. The picture entangles and traps the viewer, therefore, per design, in the captivating world of all these phantasmal images. The painting does not warn the viewer against this entrapment or teach him or her to stay away from all these curiosities. How could the painting? On the contrary, it is the very purpose of the painting to enchant you and lure you into this wondrous world. Now, that this is a treacherous offer is emblematically captured in the left wing of the Garden of Earthly Delights, where an owl is perched here in the center, where an owl is perched in the center of this elegant fountain, which is situated on a rocky shore, shining with carbuncles and precious stones. This fountain, you may see, has a certain anthropomorphic gestalt, shape, suggestive of vegetative branches or arms that have attracted other birds too. The combination of these birds and the owl signals the ominous presence of the devil. Late medieval iconography uses this combination of owl and other birds to symbolize the efforts of the devil to lure and catch human souls. The viewer cannot evade the ensnaring lure of this fountain too, when his or her eyes become captivated in the suggestion of a grinning face that seems to be hiding in the complex tracery of the upper part of the fountain. This strangely grinning face serves as the counterpoint to the clear gaze of the Creator. Here, the quiet clarity of the vera icon, vera icon, God's true face. There, a false phantasmagoric grin that traps the eye of curiosity. There you are not entirely sure what you are looking at, or if that what is looking at you really exists. But the viewer can evade nor resist either of the two. In the Haywind triptych, the tiny figure of Christ hovering in the sky high above the world, in a configuration reminiscent of the Last Judgment, offers a similar anchor point for the viewer's reflection on the tumbling, fighting crowd in the painting that follows the cart of greed right into hell below. I will not discuss this painting in detail, but like to point to the role of the huge hay cart which dominates the center of the composition in relation to the greedy crowd and the image of Christ. As the hay covers a large surface area in the center without showing specific storytelling motifs, it pushes the attention of the viewer automatically downward to the multitude of grabbing, fighting, and wailing men and women of all classes, social ranks, and beliefs, preceded by the demons and devils who drag the cart with hay and the crowd that follows it towards its infernal destination on the right. The viewer is thus visually captivated, almost forced, captivated, entangled in the very world of hay, which was connoted with vanitas, vanity, which literally meant emptiness, fleetingness, lack of substance. Until one takes a step back, you as a viewer take a step back, distance yourself from the petty details of human greed that you have also fallen to with your eyes, and align your gaze with the bird's eye view of the divine onlooker and see the broader picture. It is interesting to compare this work with Pieter Bruegel's recently acquired painting, tempera painting of the distribution of wine at St. Martin's Day here at the Prado, which plays with the same contrast between visual complexity and a pictorial aside, an anchor aside that functions as a visually haven for reflection. The center of the image is filled with a huge pile of human bodies engaged in frenetic efforts to get a share of the wine that is offered to the poor from an elevated wine barrel on the occasion of St. Martin's Day. With a few exceptions, all of them are men, poorly clothed, peasants and beggars, who in their collective struggle to fill a cup or jug form a mountain of bodies, legs, arms, heads, and which are rendered in all possible body postures, angles and expressions of excitement. The battered state, the state of the painting is not 100% perfect. The battered state of the painting's surface does not allow the modern viewer to make out precisely all storytelling details that the painting originally must have had. One example, here visible in the foreground, such as a man, if it is a man, here, trying to steal the purse of a woman, if you look carefully, trying to steal the purse of a woman who quenches her thirst while carrying a baby on her arm, child on her arm. These kind of details must have been far more frequent in the painting, but cannot be detected in all detail right now anymore. But such details will have contributed to the effect of this human anthill to draw the viewer into the melee of carousers and sots and get you, viewer, visually entangled in their quest for self-intoxication. You, on your part, only in an aesthetic way, of course. The figure of St. Martin, the figure on St. Martin on the right, who cuts his mantle into two, is the altruistic antipode of the self-indulged crowd, and offers the viewer the same kind of aside that the Haywain triptych, which Bruegel actually may have known, offers with the marginal figure of Christ above. Both paintings transfer the critical and edifying function of the marginal illustration in late medieval manuscript painting into the realm of large-scale panel and cloth painting. However, here the emphasis is on offering the viewer a beacon for self-reflection on his or her own, that is your, perceptional attitudes. That is your, mine, proclivity to satisfy our curiosity, visual curiosity, which may be considered to be a visual equivalent of greed. And it is the capacity of Bruegel's multi-layered art, moreover, at the same time, to direct the viewer's attention to the painter's ability to pictorially capture an incredible variety of human means and postures, portrayed from all kinds of angles, which underscores Ortelius's claim, the friend and humanist, the friend of Pieter Bruegel, that Bruegel had mastered nature like no other artist. The poor folks here that serve as actors in Bruegel's display of artifice in representing the weirdest postures that humans can take. These poor folks, in one respect, are similar to the tumbling demons in Bruegel's Fall of the Rebel Angels that we saw earlier. These peasants are now curiosities, in a way, despite the fact that Bruegel has rendered them with highly idiosyncratic features. He has rendered them not as individual persons and creatures in their own right, but as objects, as personnel, so to speak, of curiosity and artifice. Now, all of this comes to a bearing more particularly, and I'm going to go in some detail here, in Bruegel's landscape with Christ carrying the cross in Vienna, in which a more overt religious dimension becomes apparent in this pictorial rhetoric of anchoring a visually dominating, complex image which ensnares the viewer in a voracious exploration of curiosities with a marginal scene representing the counter values of self-reflection, spiritual sight, and disentanglement from the world of appearances. One might think, and this aside is at least in part the figure of Christ falling under the cross, who is hardly visible, another example of the same type of picture that we saw last week. One could think, I think it's not true, but one could think that this aside entails an element of auto-iconoclastic critique, so to speak. I offer you, as a painter, all these curiosities, and then offer you a counterpoint, a visual haven for reflection, which in a way critiques your involvement in these beautiful curiosities. I do not think that this marginal scene does have this auto-iconoclastic function. That would be kind of weird. But this does not do justice to the underlying tradition of speculative thought. It is the idea that the visible world, the created world, including the artistically created world of pictorial representation, can be the starting point for a process of spiritual ascent. That is to say that these small scenes, marginal scenes in the background of these paintings help you to reflect on the fact that you fall for these beautiful curiosities, and that therefore these beautiful curiosities are not bad, but could be a starting point for changing your perspective or taking a step back and looking at your own way of looking at paintings. And there is a religious context for this. In the mystical tradition, informing this kind of thought, being involved in the world and then taking a step back. In the mystical tradition underlying this thought in the late Middle Ages, and I mentioned the well-known people of Bonaventura, Meister Eckhart, but also the Dutch mystic Ruysbroek. In this tradition, the process of spiritual ascent not only means turning on oneself away from the visible world to the invisible world, and turning inwardly, but also to turn upwardly to the divine. Turning to the divine and turning inwardly. This process aims at retaining the state of visio Dei, of spiritually seeing God, in which Adam and Eve once were created before the fall. In that state, Adam and Eve could see God, the Creator, even in the figure of Christ, as we see it in the Garden of Earthly Lights. That shows you Adam and Eve seeing God before the fall. That capacity which they lost and we have all lost after and with the fall can be regained, late medieval thinkers say, by training the inner eye and starting with the outward world. This state that can be regained, not so much in this life, ideally, but especially in the afterlife. But what one can do is working at the reformation of the inner self. That's a term that you hear quite often in this context. At redirecting the mind's eye to God and to the inner self through meditation, contemplation, and what was called speculation. During our lifetime, these what is called mystagogical minds these mystagogical ascents or descents into the self cannot be an aim in itself. One always needs to return to the world where you live in, to look back to the world, to look back to the concrete world in which we live. And once you have attained this spiritual sight and go back to the world, you can see the world with a transcending eye. This language may sound to you a little bit too mystical for the modern ear to be relevant, it seems, for the worldly realm of art, especially since we are talking about pictures that were created in the Northern Renaissance in the mid-16th century. It is important to realize, however, that the religious movement of the Devotia Moderna which was widespread in the Netherlands and propagated this kind of thinking, popularized this mystical thought and mystical ideas of restoring your inner ability of spiritual sight through engagement with the world, and through the world would ascend to God, or reflect on your inner vision, reflect on your inner self as well, and reform your inner self. These writings of the Devotia Moderna were actually geared to lay audiences. Initially in the late 14th and early 15th century, these lay audiences consisted of a small group of lay people who aspired to live like monks and nuns in small communities, the so-called brothers and sisters of common life. But by the late 15th century, that is at the time of Bosch, the Devotia Moderna had become a major educational force for a much broader population, as their adherents dominated, that is the people who propagated the Devotia Moderna, dominated the school system in many cities and many towns, including in Den Bosch, the hometown of Bosch. Even after Devotia Moderna had lost its attraction in the wake of the religious turbulences of the Reformation in the early 16th century, its teachings of spiritual reformation, reforming your inner ability of inner sight, was still echoed in public theater plays, for example, organized in several towns in the southern Netherlands around the middle of the 16th century. That is, at the time of Bruegel. Theater plays which staged stills of spiritually seeking performances with allegorical personifications and tableaux vivants. So imagine you're on a stage or you see a theater play that stages how to see spiritually with your inner eye. That is quite a performance act. That would be even quite a performance act for a modern artist. But this is the religious and spiritual background, the context, against which Pieter Bruegel's art should be seen, in addition to what has been claimed an Erasmian humanistic religiosity, which had its adherents in Bruegel circles, such as Abraham Ortelius or the Cardinal Granvelle, with its emphasis on self-knowledge, self-reflection, inner spirituality, and a critical stance towards the official church. Now, all of this, I think, plays a certain role when we look at this painting by Bruegel, the landscape with Christ carrying the cross, which I'm now going to show you in some detail. The painting shows in the center the figure of Christ falling under the weight of the cross on the way to Calvary, as a tiny motif, almost disappearing in the crowd that has joined the procession of bailiffs and magistrates on their way to Golgotha. Golgotha is visible way in the background on the right. Several hundreds of figures are spread out over a vast landscape, which, despite the representation of Jerusalem in the far left, is primarily to be understood as a world landscape, that is, as representing the world that we live in an all-encompassing sense. Also in the sense of the world, the secular world that we live in. This notion of a world landscape has an even more specific connotation of our secular era here in the Low Countries, which you have to take into account. And which is brought out in part by the local Flemish architecture in the background, but much more so by the contemporary clothing and activities and actions of the magistrates, onlookers, and all the people forming the procession. The road to Calvary takes place in the here and now. That's what the painting tells you first. The viewer can spend hours, perhaps, with scrutinizing the many storytelling details, or just the facial expressions, the bodily postures, and trivial activities, it seems, that many figures display. Viewers who take the time doing so, and have an opportunity to do so if they're being allowed by the guards in museum in Vienna, will discover an entire encyclopedia of human behavior related to the main theme of the picture. That is, how do people, in general, including you and me, how do people react to the figure of the suffering Christ, who is hardly visible in the world around us? Some of these onlookers appear to go after their own business and don't seem to relate to the event at all. Such, on the left, as the peasants who pass by the Calvary procession heading for the market in the opposite direction, not to Golgotha, but in the opposite direction, going to the market laden with the produce of the fields. In many cases, however, the viewer we can detect often by carefully observing and contemplating inconspicuous, seemingly unimportant contingent details. We can detect a particular response in these very details, in these very storytelling details, we can detect the way how people actually react to the figure of Christ. I will give a few examples. One example is the wife or female companion of Simon of Cyrene, who tries to prevent her husband to be dragged away in order to help Jesus carrying the cross, something that the scriptures tell us. While she herself carries, as token of her devotion, a rosary with a cross. So she tries to avoid that Simon of Cyrene is helping Christ carrying the cross, where she is actually carrying the cross. At least a sign thereof. It is clear that this blatant contradiction tells the viewer something about a contrast between words and deeds. The frequent recitation of Ave Maria prayers and Jesus' prayer of our Lord was the essence of praying the rosary. But it was also seen as a sign of outward false religiosity, and it was seen to be in contrast to true inner religiosity and private prayer. This may be perceived and may sound like an echoing humanist and Protestant Lutheran critique of the superficial nature of the traditional church and the Catholic religiosity. Because this critique was specifically directed against the rosary devotion because of the habit of many people to publicly carry around, as the woman does, publicly carrying around a string of rosary beads as a sign, as a proof of your religiosity. This potentially anti-church institutional dimension is even more apparent in another anecdotal scene, and now quite strikingly. So what you just not see is, or actually see here, is that Jesus is preceded by a horse-drawn wagon, which is used for carrying the two convicted murderers who, according to the scriptures, were crucified together with Jesus on Golgotha. They're being transported to Golgotha in a cart. Two representatives of the church, I'll point them out to you if I can, here, and later I will ask your attention for this person. But first, the first two. Two representatives of the church, a Franciscan monk and a priest, offered the convicts, one of whom holds a small cross, comfort and exhortations to confess their sins. While this can be interpreted as an act of compassion with no negative connotations regarding the church, another seemingly trivial detail casts a negative light on this act of mercy. Namely, the fact that the cart goes through a very dirty patch of the road. You see the water and the dirt dripping from the wheel, which actually causes the foreman to lift his legs. He doesn't want his legs to get wet. But how does this relate to Christ? Christ, who is not being carried, but is carrying the weight of the cross, has to cross the same filthy spot with no assistance or compassion of the representatives of the church. A third man of the church, this person, which, to judge by his habit, might be a Cistercian monk, but definitely a monk, displays another form of unchristian behavior. While walking next to the cart, he has folded his hands in prayer. He has lifted his face up, but he's not looking at Christ. he directs his attention, that is his true devotion, look at his hands, to a flag showing the emblem of the Habsburg Emperor. That is to say, this monk's true loyalty regards the state, the magistrates, the worldly powers who have convicted Jesus, not Christ himself. Many other people too, watching the procession or strolling along in the direction of Golgotha, don't show a particular interest in the subject of the spectacle and are more focused on their own day-to-day lives. The question for us then is whether we, viewers of the painting, are expected to take a similar relaxed stance when observing genre-like motifs, such as the peasant going to the market, or the men and women who take advantage of the consternation and walk away with some goods. Here, just right. Some goods that are left because of the strife around Simon and Cyrene. Do we need to take these genre motifs seriously in any particular form? Is the lamp with its legs tied, as you see here, tied together with a rope, apparently originally with the intention by Simon of Cyrene and his wife to be sold and slaughtered on the market? Is this truly a neutral genre motif in the presence of Jesus, who was called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world? Are the bystanders at the riot around Simon of Cyrene, as some art historians have argued, really so, meant to bring a smile on your face? Did Bruegel add the men who take off their hats in the background out of awe and respect for the magistrates behind Christ? Did Bruegel add these figures for reasons of sheer couleur locale, or should we judge this behavior from a Christocentric point of view, and thus lacking the kind of devotion and attention for Christ that they show to the magistrate? But then should we look at all bystanders and onlookers, even children, from this perspective? And you have to understand that this particular detail is about 4 millimeters big, the size of these figures, in the background of Pieter Bruegel. So you really, really have to delve with your eyes into the painting to see this. And then if you see it, how should we look at these children? What about the children here who try to avoid getting wet feet on the slippery path to Golgotha? Is this just the play of innocent children, or should we balance this charming anecdote against Christ's struggle on the muddy road to Golgotha? Should we relate everything to Christ? Is the black crow sitting on a torture wheel on the other side of the composition, who is waiting for the next criminal to be put on this rack? Is this a formal pun? Like, as this black crow is waiting for its victim, is this a formal pun on what we see here? The people who have gathered in the distance in the circle waiting for the crucifixion. Do all these motifs have a bearing on the loneliness of Christ in the midst of the crowd? What the figures mentioned so far have in common is a lack of compassion, that's what you can say, a lack of compassion with their Savior. A lack of compassion of a particular kind, that is, the ability or willingness to perceive the event with the eyes of their heart, which was a very important concept in the Devotia Moderna. Seeing with your spiritual eye was one thing, but seeing with the eye of your heart, that was the ultimate deed and ultimate achievement of inner vision, the eye of compassion. This expression was used in Devotia Moderna to characterize this inner spirituality at its best, and was driven by the desire to reach a form of inner conformity with Christ through compassionate meditation. That is to say, through a form of meditation that aimed at portraying the events of Christ's life, especially the Passion, before your inner eye, as if to experience Christ's presence in your own heart. See Christ's presence with the eyes of the heart in the inner self. But seeing Christ with the eye of the heart was not only an act of inner vision during meditation, but strangely enough, there are many sources that testify to this, it was also an act of outward vision, in the sense that a devout person would imaginatively project the events of the Passion onto the here and now, onto your own life circumstances. And thus align the simple events of daily life with the history of salvation. And you can understand that this effort to align the events of your inner life and your own life to the history of salvation, that is the figure of Christ in the Passion, is something that this painting clearly resonates with. Of course, the act of viewing Pieter Bruegel's landscape with Christ carrying the cross cannot simply be equated with a devotional exercise. But devotional exercises clearly informed the culture of refining, sophisticating your perceptive abilities. By depicting human activities that are not immediately obvious as examples of depriving Christ from compassion, the painting appeals to, or even creates, a kind of, on your part, a kind of connoisseurship of the inner eye. Or it appeals to your connoisseurship of the inner eye. That at least in part is a descendant of the meditative ideals of the Devotia Moderna. Now, not everyone in this painting is withholding Jesus, his or her sympathy. Not too far from Jesus, as you can see here, actually facing him, are two women and a man with a child on his arm. The women are weeping, covering their eyes with their hands for sorrow. They exemplify the ideal of seeing with the eyes of the heart, of course. What is striking, and this may frame the critical question of true Christian behavior also in institutional terms, what is striking is that these people seem to be gypsies, judging the headdress of one of the women. But two nearby men, these men here, a man and a child, one of whom is dressed in a way suggestive of the same ethnicity, namely that they are gypsies, they literally turn a blind eye on Jesus. They avert their gazes and walk away with bowed heads. So the two groups belonging to the same ethnicity, if you will, illustrate the fact that compassion and spiritual blindness equally divide believers and non-believers. All other persons showing signs of grief and compassion are concentrated in the foreground, in the right corner of the composition. A position of a side of a marginal position that is clearly reminiscent of the other examples that I gave you, in Bosch and in Bruegel. Quite striking, again, is the fact that almost all of them, first of all, the Virgin Mary, assisted by Mary Magdalene and other female companion, and John, Jesus' disciple, that they physically have turned their backs on the spectacle. They have turned their backs, so to speak, on Christ. But of course, outwardly, not inwardly. Inwardly, they are clearly stricken by grief. Located on a slightly elevated section in the landscape, a barren piece of land with thistles, human bones, and a skull that visualize the mourner's inner state, they offer a similar haven of detachment from the bustling crowd that we have encountered in this painting and others as well. These figures offer the haven or retreat of meditative compassion that offer viewers of the painting, us, a visual refuge for resting our eyes of curiosity and cultivating our eyes of our heart. Now, perhaps the most enticing examples in Bruegel's work of visually complex imagery that entangles the gaze of the viewer in a myriad of details versus a single image offering a refuge of clarity for the inner eye are Bruegel's representations of the demonic. And I would like to consider some of them briefly here from the perspective of landscape as an image of the inner world. Landscape as an image of man and women's inner world, of our inner world, is a theme that manifests itself in different ways in Bosch's oeuvre. And in almost all of this, I have to go back again to the Garden of Earthly Delights as well. The center of the Garden of Earthly Delights, and I may have opportunity to explore this a little bit in our last lecture here. The center of the Garden of Earthly Delights is first and foremost a representation of a dream world. That is, it depicts the kind of paradise that mankind, we, dream for ourselves since the fall. That the activities the naked men and women dream to be engaged in are bodily in nature and take place in a variant of courtly love garden does not contradict the inner imaginative nature of the place. This place is the worldly counterpart of this place, the Hortus Conclusus, the garden of the soul, of which the Virgin is the patroness. At the same time, the image represents the fallen state of God's creation, and as such also shares in the representation of the material world. That is to say, we cannot, especially if we, viewers of the painting, are dreaming this dream world together with the personnel in the painting, if we become, by sheer looking at the painting, become part of this dream world, we cannot distinguish anymore what is the physical, real world, the material world surrounding us, and what is the world inside our heads. The two intermingle. We lose the sense of judgment in that respect when we dream, especially if we are intoxicated by the fruit and nectar of the fruit of love. The landscape setting of the phantasms with which demons try to attack St. Anthony's mental health in Bosch's Lisbon triptych is equally a double image, a double image of the hermit's inner and outer world, his physical surroundings, but also his imaginations. Are these phantasms real or not real? Are they the product of his imagination, or do they really exist in the form we see it or in other forms? What is striking in Bosch's representation of these phantasms is that the latter appear so real that we cannot distinguish them, at least in their appearance, from the material world. Bosch does so in order to convey the idea, and for us the concrete experience, that the demonic powers as such are as real as the material world. For the viewers of his paintings, this experiential component is nowhere felt stronger than in the double images of vaguely anthropomorphic or zoomorphic monstrous shapes that are hidden in nature. If I would do justice to this painting, I would need to stop here lecturing, and I would actually need to ask you, do you see a strange face here? And by asking the question and by pushing the impulse of your interest in the painting, we would engage in an interesting discussion perhaps on what it is that we actually see. That process would do more justice than my lecture actually. But it is my task to give the lecture, so I will fulfill this role of questioning the painting for you. The cave in which Saint Jerome is seeking shelter in order to flee the world and give himself to the inner world of meditation and contemplation, on close inspection, if you look carefully, appears to be a huge mouth protruding from a rocky skull. The image signals that the presence of a demonic power is actually threatening the hermit. But the real target of the phantasmal shape is not so much the hermit who is concentrating on the crucifix as the viewer. You see or don't see this strange skull in the background that is actually the petrified form of the mouth of hell. The viewer's mind and eyes are thus inextricably intertwined, entangled in the phantasmal world of the painting, to a degree that we cannot distinguish our own imagination of what we see from the world of appearances that physically and mentally are around us. We are even more entangled in the phantasms than Jerome. The idea of landscape as an exteriorization of the inner world of the mind, merged with a representation of the physical world, occurs in Breugel's work too. Not only Bosch, but also Bruegel. Most dramatically, perhaps, in his famous engraving of 1556 of the Tribulations of St. Anthony. The print shows a large head floating in a vast river landscape that is littered with demonic figures, which give the realistic Flemish character of the landscape a distinctly infernal appearance at the same time. It's a Flemish landscape, but also an infernal landscape. The right corner of the image is occupied by a relatively inconspicuous figure of St. Anthony, who is meditating on the scriptures. He has raised his hand, his right hand, in a blessing gesture, echoing the legendary tale that the hermit exposed the demonic, showed what they were, exposed the demonic apparitions that haunted him as phantasms without substance by making the sign of the cross. Which did not mean that the demons didn't exist, but they didn't exist in the form they made themselves manifest to him. As a token that he does not warrant them reality, Anthony, in Breugel's engraving, has turned his back to the demons. More enigmatic is the identity of the huge human head. Who is this head? Who does it belong to? That is floating in the water, attacked and seriously inflicted by hosts of demons. In many Boschian works, Bosch-like works of Breugel's contemporaries, and also in his own, one encounters a large monstrous head located somewhere in an infernal landscape, such as here in a painting in New York. Here, the association with the mouth or gates of hell is evident, even if the face is represented as an infernal apparition rather than as the actual entrance to hell. Breugel's head is slightly more human, and the fact that it is floating like a ship seems to live or suffer from some kind of symbiosis with a large tree and a decaying fish on his head shows some kind of similarity with the tree man, this strange image on the hell panel in the Garden of Earthly Delights. There, in both cases, we seem to be facing, as in a mirror, an image of the world's morbid mental state, our state, caused by devilish forces that affect man's outer senses and turn the human mind itself into the mouth of hell. Where's the mouth of hell? Right here. There are small details possibly pointing to a more specific religious or perhaps even anti-clerical discourse underlying the image, I mean in Breugel's case. A banner with a cross is raised in top of one of the branches behind the face, behind the fish. And some of the figures occupying the interior of the head seem to wear monk hoods. So, the billowing smoke rising from the mouth echoes the smoke rising from a huge fire behind a church in the background. Does all of this refer to the religious crisis of the church? Or does this all refer to the religious crisis in my head? I would like to end this lecture and this series of examples with a brief remark on Pieter Bruegel's Triumph of Death, his famous painting here in the Prado Museum. Another key work of this famous artist here. This is perhaps the most paradoxical painting in Bruegel's entire oeuvre, because on the surface of it, it is his most somber world landscape. No one and nothing escapes the killing of the death squads, consisting of hundreds of human corpses that have come to life and attack the living and drive them without exception into their deaths. Usually, The painting is considered to be an allegory of the triumph of death that stands in the medieval tradition of the dance of death, which holds a mirror to the viewer. These kind of images hold a mirror to the viewer to remind him or her, you and me, that literally no one, regardless of our social status or origin, will escape this fate. Bruegel's painting, in accordance with this tradition, depicts in the foreground representatives of the highest classes. An emperor, a cardinal, knights and nobles, some of whom are furiously or foolishly and fearfully fighting their fate. The rest of the painting is given to many hundreds of figures of all kinds, living and dead, entangled, in a fight with only one outcome. On one level, despite its theme, and this is perhaps the least, one has to say that this is perhaps the least religious picture in Bruegel's work of all, strangely enough. Because one can discern a few isolated crosses here and there in the desolate landscape, but no saint, no religious power is in sight that could offer relief or comfort. Even the man in the background here, who is about to be decapitated and holds a small cross in his hands, will die a lonely death. Some art historians assume that Bruegel's painting implicitly reflects the religious strife and violent conflicts of his day, with references to the war between Catholics and Protestants, the actions of the Inquisition, or the atrocities of mercenaries that roamed the countryside in the southern Netherlands. There are no banners or signs of religious political affiliation, however, visible in the chaotic combat scenes. If there is a religious sign, a single sign of hope, of afterlife perhaps, it is the tiny silhouette of a church visible on the horizon. Oh, here. But too far to tell to which church or religious faction or affiliation this would stand for. And perhaps this is a willfully non-denominational sign of hope. And if so, it may tell us a little bit about Bruegel's own religious convictions. But the major point I would like to make here is that we are facing a striking paradox. Bruegel has decided to depict the absolutism of the triumph of death with a myriad of details that as such are not necessary to educate you, to remind you or convince you that you're going to die. There's no educational purpose to this. The extraordinary variety of combat scenes, executions, and expositions of fear and despair, down to scenes that are even humorous to a certain extent in the lower right corner, where a soldier of death, you see a soldier of death in a fool's costume, that extraordinary variety must serve another goal. This goal may be to present the viewer with a sample of the ability of Bruegel's art to imitate and even surpass nature in the realm of death. For the most striking aspect in all of this is the exceptional care, variety, and characteristic naturalness with which Bruegel has rendered the actions and poses of the dead down to the tiniest figure far in the background. All these dead corpses seem alive and full of energy, more so than their living counterparts, who are soon to join their ranks, of course. It is this liveliness of the dead and the striking naturalness of their poses that perhaps most of all satisfy the curiosity of us, the viewers, and that entangle us in a fascination for deadly details from which we do not want or could fly and flee. If this interpretation is correct, Bruegel's art has reached a new level of sophistication in its ability to make the viewer reflect on the relationship between Bruegel's art and nature, and admire the complex artifice of Bruegel's lively book of dead nature in painted form. Thank you very much.